What if the most brutal campaign of World War II was a secret? A forgotten war where the jungle devoured 5 times more soldiers than the enemy, and where American GIs faced a horror unlike any other. This is the story of an impossible road, built on a mountain of secrets and sacrifice, deep in the heart of a green hell. Stay with us to the very end, because we will uncover the shocking story of the brilliant, hated American general who crushed the Japanese, only to be betrayed by his own allies at the moment of his greatest triumph. You'll discover the grim fate of an elite American unit that annihilated an enemy army and was then tragically abandoned. This is the story you were never meant to hear. Before we begin our march into the jungle, make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit the like button if you enjoy our content. Let us know in the comments which part of this story shocks you the most. Now, let's uncover the truth behind the Stilwell Road. By 1937, China was a nation on its knees, fighting a war it seemed destined to lose. The Japanese war machine, a modern behemoth, had moved in from the north and east, systematically seizing ports and railways, clamping its steel jaws shut on the nation's coastline. China was being slowly suffocated, cut off from the outside world and the tools it needed to resist. Ammunition, fuel, medicine, the very lifeblood of a modern army, could no longer get in. The great powers of the world offered sympathies, but their ships could find no friendly port. It seemed only a matter of time before the last pockets of resistance flickered and went out. But then, out of this desperation, came a mad, beautiful idea, a gamble. If the sea was closed, why not forge a new path over land? The map offered a sliver of hope. A route from the port of Rangoon in British-controlled Burma, north through treacherous mountains, and across the border into China's Yunnan province. On paper, it looked improbable. In reality, it was considered impossible. The terrain was a nightmare, a chaotic jumble of jagged peaks that clawed at the sky, impossibly deep gorges that plunged into shadow, and dense, malarial jungles that had swallowed men and empires whole. This was a land that actively resisted being tamed, a place where the monsoon wasn't just rain, but a liquid wall that could wash away roads as fast as they were built. Yet, they began. The project wasn't driven by fleets of bulldozers or modern excavators. There were none to be had. It was carved out of the earth by hand, hundreds of thousands of them. Men, women, and even children from the surrounding villages were mobilized, a human river of determination. Their tools were primitive: wicker baskets to move earth, hammers and chisels to splinter rock, and a terrifying, unstable form of dynamite. They worked suspended from cliffs on flimsy ropes, their silhouettes like spiders against the vast, unforgiving rock faces. The mountains claimed their share, and the jungle took its toll, but the line on the map slowly, painfully became a reality. Inch by agonizing inch, they clawed a path through the wilderness. For over 700 miles, they built a road that clung to mountainsides, spanned canyons with rickety-looking bridges, and snaked through valleys. When it was finished, it was less a road and more a 700-mile scar of defiance etched across the face of Asia. And along this scar, the convoys began to move. The rumble of engines, a sound of hope, echoed through the canyons. Trucks, overloaded and straining, crawled along the narrow path, carrying the precious cargo that kept a nation fighting. Every barrel of gasoline was another day of flight for the tiny Chinese Air Force. Every crate of bullets was a shout of defiance against the invaders. Every bag of medicine was a life saved, a soldier returned to the line. This wasn't just a supply route, it was an artery. The Burma Road was the lifeline that connected China's beating heart to the outside world, pumping in just enough strength to keep it from collapsing. It was a testament to what a people pushed to the very brink could achieve with nothing but their bare hands and an unbreakable will to survive. But how long could such a fragile thread hold against the steel jaws of an empire looking for the final, decisive blow? The blow, when it came, wasn't a frontal assault, but a poisoned dagger in the dark. In the early weeks of 1942, while the world was distracted by grand battles elsewhere, the shadow creeping from the south finally took form. The Japanese 15th Army crossed into Burma from Thailand. To the British commanders in their crisp uniforms, sitting in Rangoon, it seemed like a distant problem, a border skirmish. They had confidence in their positions, in the sheer impenetrability of the jungle. They believed the jungle was their ally, a great green wall that would swallow any conventional army. It was a fatal miscalculation. They failed to understand that for these new invaders, the jungle wasn't an obstacle, it was a highway. The Japanese soldiers were unlike any enemy the British and Indian troops had faced before. They were ghosts in the green. Traveling light, carrying minimal supplies, they didn't stick to the few dusty roads. They flowed through the dense undergrowth, silent and swift, using forgotten trails and paths known only to local villagers. They moved by night, striking at dawn. Not where they were expected, but from the flanks, from the rear, from everywhere at once. The Allied forces, trained for a different kind of war, found themselves pinned to the roads they were trying to defend, their supply lines suddenly severed by an enemy who had simply walked around them. Panic began to set in. How can you fight an enemy you can't see? How do you defend a front line when it turns out to be a circle? The fighting was a confused, terrifying affair. It wasn't a war of neat battle lines, but of sudden, vicious ambushes in the suffocating humidity. A platoon would be marching down a road hemmed in by impenetrable walls of bamboo and teak, only for the jungle itself to erupt in gunfire. The crack of a Japanese rifle, so distinct from their own, would be the first and last thing many heard. The Chinese armies sent to help, though hardened by years of war, were poorly equipped and just as vulnerable to the Japanese tactics of encirclement. Morale began to fray, then to tear. Soldiers lost and cut off from their units would stumble through the jungle, hunted not only by the enemy but by disease and starvation. The Great Green Wall had turned on its defenders. The ultimate prize was Rangoon, the port where the lifeline began. As the Japanese forces bypassed one defensive position after another, a dreadful realization dawned on the Allied command. They weren't just being pushed back, they were being systematically trapped. The advance on the capital was relentless. The city, once a bustling colonial hub, dissolved into chaos as the enemy drew near. In March, it fell. The docks, where precious supplies had been unloaded, were now in enemy hands. The warehouses, filled with the tools of war meant for China, were captured. With the fall of Rangoon, the Burma Road was severed at its root. The artery was cut, the lifeline was no more. The hope that had been so painstakingly carved into the mountains was now just a road leading from nowhere to a lost cause. For the thousands of Allied soldiers still in Burma, the question was no longer about supplying China. It was about their own survival. There was no order for a general retreat because there was no general left to give it. Command and control had simply dissolved, evaporating like mist in the oppressive jungle heat. What was left was not an army, but a scattered collection of broken units and lost men, all moving with a desperate, instinctual urgency towards one goal: India. The walk out of Burma had begun. It wasn't a tactical withdrawal, it was a flight for life. A human tide of defeat rolling north and west, away from the unstoppable advance of the Japanese forces. The roads, where they still existed, were choked with a horrifying mix of military and civilian desperation. British officers found themselves trudging alongside Indian sepoys, bewildered Chinese soldiers, and a massive, terrified flood of civilians, Indian laborers, Burmese officials, and anyone who feared life under the new regime. They walked away from everything. Trucks, artillery pieces, and heavy equipment were abandoned where they sputtered to a halt, left to be swallowed by the jungle vines. All that mattered was what a man could carry on his own back. For most, that wasn't much. A rifle, a few dozen rounds of ammunition, and perhaps a small bag of rice. Soon, even that became too heavy. The jungle, which had been a strategic puzzle a few weeks before, now became a physical tormentor. The air was as thick as a wet blanket, making every breath a conscious effort. Leeches dropped from the trees, and the ground, a stew of mud and rotting vegetation, seemed to suck the boots right off their feet. Dysentery swept through the columns of men, leaving them weak and trembling, unable to keep up. To escape the Japanese patrols hunting the main routes, the retreating columns were forced to splinter, taking to ancient, overgrown tracks through the mountains. Here, the suffering intensified. They waded through churning, brown rivers, sometimes linking arms to form human chains against the current, losing men to the unforgiving water. Food ran out. They were reduced to eating jungle plants they barely recognized, and soon, nothing at all. The disciplined soldiers of a few weeks prior became gaunt, hollow-eyed skeletons in tattered uniforms, their march a slow, stumbling shuffle. A strange, exhausted silence fell over them, broken only by the rasp of labored breathing and the incessant drone of insects. They were walking ghosts, haunted by the disaster behind them and terrified of the wilderness that surrounded them. And then the sky began to change. The first rains of the monsoon started to fall, not a gentle shower, but a heavy, relentless downpour that turned the jungle floor into a quagmire and the mountain paths into treacherous slides. A new enemy had joined the hunt, one that couldn't be fought. The monsoon added a terrifying deadline to their escape. The mountain passes to India would soon become impassable torrents of mud and rock. It became a race against the sky itself. Finally, after weeks that felt like a lifetime, the first of the survivors stumbled out of the green hell. They crossed the border into India not as a proud army, but as ragged, skeletal apparitions. They brought with them no equipment, no intelligence reports of any value, only the story of a complete and catastrophic defeat etched under their starved faces. They had survived, but they were the ghosts of an army that no longer existed, and their arrival signaled the true, devastating scale of the disaster in Burma. In the humid chaos of Assam, India, the Allied command was facing a paralyzing reality. The army that had been meant to defend Burma was gone, replaced by the traumatized survivors who now filled makeshift hospitals. With the land route to China definitively severed, a chilling question hung in the air. Was China lost? Letting the nation fall was unthinkable. It would free up millions of Japanese soldiers and create an unstoppable juggernaut in Asia. So, with all conventional options gone, they turned their eyes upward, toward the most formidable mountain range on Earth. The plan they conceived was born not of strategy, but of pure, unadulterated desperation. They would build a bridge in the sky. They would fly over the Himalayas. They called the route the Hump. It was a deceptively simple name for a flight path that was, in reality, a pilot's worst nightmare. From the muddy, hastily constructed airfields in India, unarmed and overloaded transport planes, mostly C-47s and the temperamental C-46s, would lumber into the sky. Their mission was to climb to altitudes where the air was dangerously thin, navigating a treacherous skyscape of jagged peaks that soared over 20,000 feet. These were not sleek fighter jets. They were flying trucks, slow and vulnerable, pushed far beyond the limits of their design. The pilots, a mix of seasoned veterans and young men who had barely earned their wings, were flying into a region whose weather patterns were a complete mystery. Once airborne, they faced a trinity of terrors. First was the weather. The Hump was home to some of the most violent atmospheric conditions on the planet. Unpredictable jet streams, discovered by the pilots who were torn apart by them, could flip a plane upside down in seconds. Thunderstorms of unimaginable ferocity would appear out of nowhere, encasing the aircraft in ice that grew heavy on the wings, dragging them down towards the peaks below. Then there was the terrain itself. On the rare, clear day, the view of the snow-capped mountains was beautiful, but it was the beauty of a predator. There was nowhere to land, nowhere to go if an engine failed. A single mechanical issue was a final verdict. And finally, there were the Japanese Zeros lurking at the edges of the route, ready to pounce on any lone, struggling transport. The cost of this aerial bridge was staggering. The route became grimly known as the Aluminum Trail. The valleys and mountainsides of the Himalayas became a graveyard of twisted metal, littered with the wreckage of hundreds of Allied planes. For new pilots, the grim joke was that they could navigate the route simply by following the glint of sunlight off the crumpled fuselages of those who had gone before. Yet, for every plane that was lost, more took off. They carried the essentials: drums of fuel, crates of ammunition, engine parts, and medical supplies. Each successful landing in Kunming, China, was a victory against nature, a defiance of logic. This bridge in the sky was fragile, terrifying, and paid for with a heavy toll in men and machines. It wasn't a sustainable solution, everyone knew that. It was a finger in the dike, a desperate, heroic measure to keep China breathing while, on the ground, a new, even madder idea began to take shape. The aluminum trail bleeding across the Himalayas was a testament to courage, but it was a strategic failure. For every ton of fuel that reached China, another was burned by the transport planes themselves. The trickle of supplies kept China from collapsing, but it could never be enough to help it fight back. While most Allied leaders accepted this grim arithmetic and focused on the air bridge, one man stared at the map with a furious, impatient glare. U.S. General Joseph Stilwell, the American commander of the China-Burma-India Theater, was a man carved from granite and vinegar. He was notoriously abrasive, famously difficult, and possessed an iron will that bordered on obsession. They called him Vinegar Joe, and he hated the hump airlift. He saw it as a temporary fix, a defensive move in a war he believed could only be won by attacking. While others looked to the sky, Stilwell kept his eyes fixed on the mud. He was going to get a road. His plan was met with undisguised skepticism, particularly from his British allies. They had surveyed the proposed route from Ledo in India over the Patkai Mountains and into northern Burma. Their engineers had looked at the sawtooth peaks, the 150 inches of annual monsoon rain, and the bottomless mud and declared the project a fantasy. Impossible was the official verdict. But impossible was a word that only fueled Stilwell's stubbornness. He trusted American engineering and American machinery. He believed that where British caution saw an impassable barrier, American grit and bulldozers would see a problem to be solved. It was a colossal gamble, staking thousands of men and a fortune in equipment on a project that many of the most experienced engineers in the world believed was doomed. The operation began not with a bang, but with the chugging of a train. To the sleepy, rain-soaked town of Ledo at the very end of a railway line in Assam, the war arrived in the form of massive crates. American engineering battalions, many of them civilian construction workers and oilmen just months before, disembarked into a world of mud and unfamiliar heat. With them came their gods of creation: bulldozers, graders, steam shovels, and rock crushers. A city of tents and workshops bloomed in the muck. This was the front line of Stilwell's new war, an army whose primary weapon was the bulldozer blade and whose enemy was the earth itself. The goal was simple to state, but staggering to contemplate: carve a two-lane, all-weather road through hundreds of miles of the most difficult terrain on the planet, all while a war was being fought just down the path. The first days were an assault on the senses. The roar of diesel engines tore through the primeval silence of the jungle's edge. Giant trees, hundreds of years old, were brought crashing down. The bulldozers, painted olive drab, became mechanical beasts, clawing at the tangled green wall. They moved forward in echelons, the lead dozers clearing the jungle, followed by others that cut the hillside, and finally the graders that smoothed the path. It was brutal, ugly, and deafening work. The first mile was a nightmare of mud, tangled roots, and machine breakdowns. But it was a mile that had been declared impossible. It was a muddy, rutted, barely passable track, but it was real. Stilwell's gamble was underway. The first chips had been placed on the table, a direct challenge to the mountains that had, until now, held humanity at bay. The real fight, against the landslides, the malaria, and the coming monsoon, had not even begun. While one army of engineers attacked the jungle with bulldozers, another was being trained to embrace it as an ally. In the dusty plains of central India, a radical new vision of warfare was taking shape, driven by one of the most eccentric and brilliant military minds of the war, Brigadier Orde Wingate. Wingate was a zealot, a man possessed by an idea that ran contrary to almost every military doctrine of his time. He believed that the Japanese mastery of the jungle could be turned against them. He envisioned an army that wouldn't try to hold ground, but would flow through the wilderness like water, living deep behind enemy lines for months at a time, supplied entirely by air. They would be ghosts, striking at railways and supply dumps before melting back into the green immensity. To the military establishment, he was a difficult, messianic figure, but to the men he selected, he was a prophet. He forged a unique force, the 77th Indian Infantry Brigade, a strange and potent mix of tough British battalions, stoic Burmese riflemen who knew the terrain, and the legendary Gurkhas, arguably the finest infantrymen in the world. He subjected them to a training regimen that bordered on cruelty, designed to strip them down to their physical and mental limits, and then build them back up as a new type of soldier. They marched for punishing distances on starvation rations, learned to navigate by the stars, and became experts in demolition. He called them the Chindits, a corruption of the name for the Chinte, the mythical lion-like statues that guard Burmese temples. They were to be the guardians of a new way of war. In February 1943, the experiment began. Under the cover of darkness, Wingate's Chindits, some 3,000 strong, slipped across the Chindwen River and into Japanese-held Burma. They moved not as a single army, but as multiple columns, each an independent fighting force connected to Wingate only by radio. Their heavy equipment, radios, explosives, reserve ammunition was carried by mules, whose stubbornness and resilience made them the unsung heroes of the expedition. They disappeared into the jungle, a self-contained force moving silently through a world that was supposed to belong to the enemy. For weeks, they were ghosts. Allied command in India could only track their progress through faint, crackling radio transmissions and the delayed reports of Japanese confusion. Then they struck. The primary target was the Mandalay-Meetkina Railway, the main artery supplying the Japanese forces in northern Burma. Emerging from the jungle, the Chindits descended upon the tracks. The sharp crack of their rifles shattered the quiet, followed by the louder, crumping roar of explosives. They blew up bridges, tore up tracks, and ambushed Japanese patrols sent to investigate. For a brief, glorious period, they created chaos, forcing the Japanese to divert frontline troops to hunt for an enemy they couldn't find. Every few days, a lumbering transport plane would appear overhead, dropping precious supplies of food, ammunition, and mail by parachute into a hastily cleared patch of jungle. This was their lifeline, a fragile thread connecting them to a world they had left far behind. They had proven Wingate's core theory. A lightly armed force could penetrate deep into enemy territory and wreak havoc. But now they were hundreds of miles inside Burma. The Japanese were hunting them with increasing fury, and the long, brutal walk back out had not yet begun. If Orde Wingate's Chindits were a ghostly rapier, designed for disruption and chaos, the American answer was a sledgehammer forged for a single brutal purpose. General Stilwell, watching his Ledo Road project inch forward at a snail's pace, knew that bulldozers alone could not win this war. He needed a dedicated combat unit to march ahead of the engineers, to outflank and smash the Japanese garrisons that stood in the road's path. He needed his own version of a long-range penetration group, but one tied directly to his grand strategic objective. The call went out from President Roosevelt himself for volunteers for a dangerous and hazardous mission, and from the training camps across America, nearly 3,000 men answered. They were officially designated the 5307th Composite Unit, Provisional, a bland name for a vibrant, motley collection of men. They were city kids from Brooklyn, lean cowboys from Texas, former infantrymen, and even some disgraced soldiers looking for a second chance. Thrown together and shipped to India, they were a uniquely American experiment in jungle warfare. Their commander was General Frank Merrill, a pragmatic Stilwell protege who, unlike the theatrical Wingate, was a more down-to-earth soldier. His men would soon give the 5307th its immortal name, Merrill's Marauders. Their training was a compressed, brutal affair, designed to acclimate them to the jungle and teach them the hard-learned lessons of the Chindit campaign. Their mission, however, was fundamentally different. Where the Chindits were tasked with raiding deep and then withdrawing, the Marauders were a spearhead. Their job was to undertake long, punishing marches through the jungle to get behind the Japanese front lines, seize critical objectives, and hold them until the main force of Stilwell's Chinese armies could catch up and deliver the finishing blow. They were the anvil upon which the Chinese hammer would fall. In February 1944, they set off. After marching down the first 100 miles of the muddy track that was the new Ledo Road, they plunged into the jungle, their objective clear the path to the vital, Japanese-held town and airfield of Myitkyina. The campaign that followed was a series of grueling marches, followed by short, incredibly violent battles. At places like Wallawabam, they demonstrated their value. While the Japanese were dug in, expecting a frontal assault from the Chinese down the main trail, the Marauders would appear suddenly from the jungle at their rear, having completed a seemingly impossible flanking maneuver. The shock of their appearance, combined with their concentrated firepower from automatic weapons and mortars, would shatter the Japanese defenses. They would fight, hold, and then, after the Chinese forces had consolidated the position, they would disappear back into the green vastness to begin the next long march. They were winning, and the Ledo Road was inching forward behind them, protected by their sacrifice. But the jungle was a relentless enemy, and so were the Japanese. With every victory, the Marauders paid a heavy price in casualties, and the unit was being steadily ground down by combat, dysentery, and sheer exhaustion. The ultimate prize of Myitkyina was still a long way off, and no one knew if the spearhead would break before it reached its target. For every soldier the Japanese killed in Burma, the jungle itself claimed 5. This was the brutal, unromantic calculus of the campaign. The deadliest enemy wore no uniform, carried no rifle, and was never seen. It was the land itself, a vast, living organism that seemed to view the human intrusion with a malevolent indifference, seeking to absorb, dissolve, and reclaim all who entered. The soldiers called it the Green Hell, and the name was an understatement. It was a war fought on a biological and psychological level for which no training could ever prepare a man. The assault began from within. The water, teeming with microscopic predators, was a primary vector of attack. Amoebic dysentery was a constant, humiliating companion, a disease that would wring a strong man dry in a matter of days, leaving him a weak, trembling husk. It was a foe that shattered morale as effectively as any artillery barrage. Then came the invisible hunters carried by insects. The drone of a mosquito was not an annoyance, but a potential death sentence, carrying malaria that would rack the body with cycles of burning fever and bone-shaking chills. More insidious still was the scrub typhus, delivered by the bite of a tiny mite, which brought delirium and agonizing pain. For the men deep in the jungle, falling ill to one of these was often the end, a quiet and lonely departure far from any medical aid. The external attack was just as relentless. The air was thick with biting flies, but it was the leeches that became the stuff of nightmares. They were everywhere, dropping from trees and swarming up from the leaf litter on the ground. Soldiers would end a day's march and peel off their wet socks to find their legs crawling with dozens of the creatures, swollen and black with their own blood. The constant moisture gave birth to jungle rot, a host of fungal infections that turned a man's skin, particularly on his feet and in his groin, into a landscape of raw, weeping sores. A simple scratch, impossible to keep clean, would quickly fester into a tropical ulcer that ate away at the flesh right down to the bone. Perhaps worse than the physical decay was the erosion of the mind. The jungle was a claustrophobic prison with a ceiling of leaves and walls of impenetrable green. A soldier could rarely see more than 20 feet in any direction, creating a constant low-level paranoia. The noise was another form of torture, an incessant 24-hour symphony of buzzing insects, croaking frogs, and the strange calls of unseen birds that could fray a man's nerves until they snapped. This was the jungle happy state, a terrifying psychological breakdown where the green walls would literally feel like they were closing in. When the monsoon finally arrived, it was the jungle's ultimate offensive. It was not rain, but a solid, deafening curtain of water that fell for weeks on end, turning the world into a primordial swamp, washing away bridges and roads and plunging morale into a final sodden despair. This green hell did not care about flags or objectives. It waged a silent, total war on all who dared to enter its domain. The war in Burma was not one fight, but a dozen, fought in a babel of different languages. The Allied force that pushed back into the jungle was less a single army and more a fragile, cobbled-together coalition of vastly different cultures, yoked together by a common enemy and the sheer, abrasive will of men like Stilwell. It was an alliance that on paper should have collapsed under its own weight, yet somehow, in the shared crucible of the green hell, it became something formidable. This victory would belong to no single nation. The core of the offensive was the strange partnership between the Americans and the Chinese. Under Stilwell's command, entire Chinese divisions that had escaped Burma in 1942 were retrained and re-equipped in India. For the first time, these tough, battle-hardened Chinese soldiers were given modern American weapons, decent rations, and proper medical care. American liaison officers, often young men fresh out of college, were assigned to every level of command, tasked with coordinating logistics and advising their Chinese counterparts. The cultural friction was immense. Stilwell was famously critical of what he saw as hesitant leadership among the Chinese generals, while the Chinese, proud of their long struggle against Japan, often resented the brash, demanding style of their new American allies. Yet it worked. A new confidence grew in the Chinese ranks, and on the battlefield, they proved to be a tenacious, resilient force. Operating alongside them, but under a separate command, was the British 14th Army. It was itself a kaleidoscope of cultures, famously nicknamed the Forgotten Army, because its colossal efforts were often overlooked by the press covering the war in Europe. It comprised British battalions, but its heart and soul was the professional Indian Army, with regiments of Sikhs, Punjabis, and others led by a shared sense of duty. And among them were the Gurkhas from Nepal. They were a force apart. Quiet, unassuming men who, in the chaos of close-quarters jungle combat, became terrifyingly effective, wielding their iconic curved kukri knives with lethal skill. The Japanese learned to fear the silent professionalism of the 14th Army, a force that had absorbed the hard lessons of the 1942 defeat and had returned with a vengeance. Perhaps the most crucial element, however, was the one that operated in the shadows. Deep in northern Burma, the American Office of Strategic Services, OSS, ran Detachment 101. This small group of American officers achieved something incredible. They armed and trained the native Kachin people. The Kachin, fiercely independent and possessing an intimate knowledge of the terrain, hated the Japanese occupiers. Supplied by airdrop, they formed a highly effective guerrilla army, known as the Kachin Rangers. They became the eyes and ears of the entire Allied campaign, ambushing Japanese patrols, gathering intelligence, and rescuing downed Allied airmen. A Chinese advance would often be preceded by whispers of information from Kachin scouts, and a Japanese column would find itself harassed for miles by unseen guerrillas before ever meeting the main Allied force. This coalition was messy, complex, and often fraught with tension, but its combined strength was undeniable. It was a machine with Chinese, British, Indian, Gurkha, and American parts, guided by Cochin hands, and it was now grinding inexorably forward. Behind the advancing spearhead of Marauders and Chinese infantry, a second equally vital army was waging its own war. This was a war not of rifles and bayonets, but of bulldozers and dynamite. As soon as the combat troops cleared a valley or secured a mountain pass, the engineers moved in, often while the sound of gunfire still echoed in the distance. Their task was to transform the brutal, unforgiving landscape into a stable, all-weather highway, and to do it at a pace that defied logic. The point where the finished road met the raw jungle was known as the end of the line, a constantly moving frontier of controlled chaos. It was a 24-hour world of roaring diesel engines, shouting men, and the percussive blast of explosives, all shrouded in a permanent haze of dust or a torrential sheet of rain. The scale of the undertaking was almost impossible to comprehend. This was, month for month, one of the largest earth-moving projects on the planet. The American engineers, commanding a vast workforce of Indian, Bengali, and Chinese laborers, were moving dirt at a rate of 1 million cubic yards per mile in some sections. They were literally moving mountains. Using their machinery as weapons, they attacked the hillsides. Lead bulldozers would carve a high pioneer trace, after which other machines would shove thousands of tons of earth and rock over the edge into the valley below. They worked on the edges of precipices so steep that operators who slipped would face a final, terrifying fall of 1,000 feet. During the monsoon, the work became a special kind of hell. A hillside that had taken a week to carve into a stable roadbed could dissolve into a river of mud in a single hour of torrential rain, wiping out all their progress. This construction site was also a battlefield. Japanese patrols, cut off by the main advance, would harass the work crews from the jungle. A sniper's crack would ring out, and a bulldozer operator would slump over his controls. Work would halt, the engineers would grab their rifles, clear out the threat, and then, minutes later, the roar of the engines would start up again. Low-flying Japanese aircraft would occasionally strafe the construction sites, forcing men to dive for cover under the very machines they were operating. It was a job that required a man to be as proficient with a carbine as he was with a wrench. Snaking alongside the road, another incredible engineering feat was taking place. Crews were laying a 4-inch fuel pipeline, a metal artery that followed the road's progress mile for mile. Section by section, it was welded together and laid in the ditch beside the road, designed to pump the lifeblood of gasoline and oil from India all the way to the front lines and, eventually, to China. Every mile of road laid, every section of pipe welded, was a tangible piece of victory. It was a brutal, ugly, and punishing war of creation, pushing a spine of gravel and steel deeper and deeper into enemy territory, the essential foundation upon which the entire Allied campaign was being built. The fighting troops on the front line, the Marauders, the Chindits, the Chinese infantry, were merely the tip of a colossal spear. The shaft of that spear, the immense and complex structure that gave it weight and driving force, was a logistical network of breathtaking scale. This was the true secret weapon of the Allied campaign, the ability to create a circulatory system of supplies in the middle of a wilderness, a network of veins and arteries that could sustain a modern army in a place where armies were supposed to wither and perish. This unseen war, fought by mechanics, quartermasters, and transport crews, was what made victory possible. The heart of this system was in the sprawling depots of Assam, in India. Here, mountains of material, brought in by sea and rail, were amassed. It was a city of crates, a landscape of fuel drums, and vast open-air workshops where legions of mechanics performed miracles, cannibalizing wrecked trucks and rebuilding worn-out aircraft engines. From this heart, two main arteries pushed forward into Burma. The first was the gritty, terrestrial artery of the Ledo Road and its accompanying fuel pipeline, a steadily growing vessel of gravel and steel. The second, and arguably more vital for the forward troops, was the aerial one. As the armies advanced, specialized teams of aviation engineers would follow close behind. Their job was to identify a suitable patch of relatively flat ground, often a captured Japanese airstrip or a dried-up rice paddy, and in a matter of days, transform it into a functional forward airfield. Using pierced steel planking, they could lay down a durable runway almost anywhere, creating new nodes in the ever-expanding network. These forward airfields were the lifeblood of the campaign. They allowed the ever-present C-47 transport planes of the Air Transport Command to leapfrog supplies deep into Burma, bypassing the agonizingly slow road. From these strips, wounded soldiers could be evacuated back to hospitals in India, a crucial factor for morale. But most importantly, these fields were the basis for the most critical missions of all, the tactical airdrops to the long-range penetration groups. A column of Marauders, deep in the jungle and low on ammunition, would radio their position. Back at a forward strip, a C-47 crew would get their orders. Ground crews would hastily load the plane with parachuted crates of ammunition, K-rations, and vital medical supplies like blood plasma. The flight itself was a testament to raw courage. The unarmed plane would fly low over the jungle, often without fighter escort, searching for the prearranged drop zone marked by smoke panels. As they approached, the pilot would slow the plane to near stalling speed, making it a perfect target for any Japanese troops in the area. In the open fuselage, crewmen known as kickers would wrestle the heavy bundles to the door and, at the pilot's signal, shove them out into the rushing wind. For a few tense moments, they would circle, watching the parachutes drift down, before turning and racing for home. Through this intricate system, the depots, the road, the pipeline, the forward airfields, and the tactical airdrops, the veins of war pumped life into the Allied fists, ensuring they had the strength to keep punching. While the long-range penetration groups waged a war of movement and surprise, the brutal reality of the campaign was decided by the common infantrymen fighting a grinding, attritional war for every single ridge and hill. This was not a war of clever flanking maneuvers. This was a bloody, head-on contest of attrition, a test of which side could endure the most punishment. The main Allied armies, the American-trained Chinese divisions and the British 14th Army, were tasked with the ugly, essential job of systematically clearing the Japanese from the terrain through which the Ledo Road must pass, and the Japanese were not going to give it up easily. Their defensive doctrine was brutally effective. On the commanding heights of every ridge, they had constructed formidable networks of bunkers. These were not simple holes in the ground. They were expertly camouflaged fortresses, built from thick teak logs, earth, and stone, often connected by underground tunnels, and designed for all-around mutually supporting fire. A single ridge could be home to dozens of these positions, each housing a machine gun or a mortar crew. They were almost impervious to artillery and airstrikes. The shells would explode harmlessly on the thick earthen roofs. The only way to take a Japanese bunker was to get close enough to destroy it with grenades or a satchel charge. A battle for a ridge would unfold with a grim, predictable rhythm. It would begin with an Allied artillery barrage, a thunderous roar that filled the valleys with smoke and noise but did little to harm the defenders hunkered deep inside their fortifications. Then the whistles would blow, and the infantry would advance. Whether they were Chinese soldiers from Stilwell's X-Force or Indian sepoys from the 14th Army, the experience was the same, a grueling uphill climb into a storm of machine gun fire. Men would fall as bullets ripped through the dense foliage, often without ever seeing the enemy who had fired them. The final stage of the fight was a series of vicious, intimate encounters. A small section of men would crawl their way up under the sweeping fire, using mortars to provide covering smoke. They would reach the blind spot of a bunker and then, in a rush of desperate courage, charge the final few yards, tossing grenades through the firing slits. Sometimes it worked. More often, the charge was cut down. When a bunker was finally silenced, the exhausted attackers would consolidate, only to find themselves immediately under fire from another bunker 50 yards away, perfectly positioned to cover its fallen neighbor.
This was the war in microcosm, a yard-by-yard struggle, pushing an enemy who would not surrender out of positions they had sworn to defend to the last man. The ridges were eventually taken, but the cost was etched on the faces of the survivors who stood on the captured ground, gazing at the next jungle-clad hill in the distance, knowing the whole bloody process was about to begin again.
The raids and flanking marches of the Special Forces were more than just tactical victories. They were echoes that resonated deep within the Japanese command structure, creating a strategic paralysis that would prove fatal. While the main Allied armies hammered away at the fortified ridges, the Chindits, Marauders, and Cochin Rangers were waging a psychological war in the Japanese rear. For the Japanese commander of the 18th Division, the primary force blocking the Ledo Road, the situation became an impossible nightmare. His front was under immense pressure, yet he was constantly forced to divert his best battalions to chase ghosts. A railway would be cut 100 miles to the south, a supply dump ambushed 50 miles to the east, and precious troops would be dispatched on futile missions into a jungle that swallowed them whole. This was the hidden genius of the Allied strategy. The brutal, head-on battles for the ridges were made winnable because the Japanese defenders were often undermanned, short on ammunition, and stretched to their breaking point. The elite troops who should have been reinforcing the bunkers were instead chasing after Wingate's phantoms or trying to hunt down Merrill's men.
The Japanese army in northern Burma was being systematically bled from 1,000 tiny cuts, its strength sapped by an enemy it could not bring to a decisive battle. The Allied Special Forces were a virus in the Japanese logistical system, causing a fever of confusion and weakness that allowed the conventional armies to deliver the decisive blows. But these echoes came at a staggering human cost. The men who created them were nearly consumed in the process. After their successful 1943 raid, the 1st Chindit force was given the order to disperse and make their own way back to India. What followed was a horrific ordeal of survival. In small, starving groups, they walked for weeks, hunted by the Japanese and stalked by disease. Of the 3,000 men who had entered Burma, only about a third made it back, and of those, almost none were ever fit for combat again. They had proven a theory, but the experiment had almost destroyed them. A year later, Merrill's Marauders met a similar, though less scattered fate. After 5 months of continuous marching and fighting, they achieved their final bloody objective. But the unit that emerged from the jungle was a ghost of its former self. They were not a triumphant fighting force, but a column of walking wounded, hollow-eyed men racked with malaria, dysentery, and the profound psychological exhaustion of their ordeal. The unit had effectively ceased to exist, its strength completely expended to clear the path. The echoes they left in the jungle were the sounds of Allied victory taking shape, but for the men themselves, they were the sounds of bodies and minds pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. They were a tactical sacrifice on the altar of a greater strategic victory, their immense suffering paving the way for the final push. In late January 1945, near the dusty Burmese town of Mongyu, the blade of a bulldozer crawling south from Ledo finally touched the blade of another that had driven north from the old Burma Road. There was no grand ceremony, just a few grimy, exhausted engineers shaking hands. But with that simple metallic clang, the work was done. A land route to China, declared impossible by strategists and carved through a landscape of hellish difficulty, was open. The artery, severed for 3 agonizing years, had been rebuilt. The promise, made in the depths of defeat, was about to be kept. Back in Ledo, India, the air was thick with diesel fumes and anticipation. Lined up for miles was a column of over 100 brand-new olive-drab GMC trucks. This was the first convoy. Their cargo was not symbolic, it was the hard currency of war. The canvas-covered beds were laden with crates of artillery shells, heavy machine guns, and thousands of rounds of ammunition. The very tools that Chinese armies needed to go on the offensive. At the head of the column, a lead truck bore a sign that read "Pix Pike" in honor of the lead engineer. but everyone knew this road belonged to the sheer, stubborn will of Joseph Stilwell. The drivers, many of them veteran soldiers of the U.S. Army Transportation Corps, climbed into their cabs. They were men who had been hauling supplies along the treacherous, half-finished road for months, but this was different. This was the final journey. With a grinding of gears and a cheer from the assembled crowd, the long green snake began to move. It snaked up into the Patkai Mountains, navigating the hairpin turns and steep grades that the engineers had blasted out of the cliff faces. It drove past the ridges and valleys that had been the sites of the campaign's most brutal battles, places whose names were now synonymous with sacrifice. The drivers passed them in respectful silence. The road was a monument to the men who had fought and fallen to secure it. After days of hard driving, they crossed the border from Burma into China, the landscape subtly changing, the sense of history palpable in the air. As they approached the city of Kunming, their final destination, the reception began. It started as a trickle of curious onlookers, then swelled into a massive, joyous flood of humanity. The Chinese people, who had endured years of blockade and hardship, poured into the streets. The air erupted in a cacophony of firecrackers, a sound of celebration that momentarily drowned out the rumble of the engines. For the hardened American drivers who had seen nothing but jungle and battle for years, the sight of cheering crowds, of children waving handmade flags, was overwhelming. This was what it had all been for. When the lead truck finally rolled to a stop and officially delivered its cargo, the moment was far more than a logistical success. It was a symbol of a promise fulfilled, a lifeline restored, and the tangible beginning of the end for the Japanese Empire in China. In the wake of the first convoy's triumphant arrival, the world finally took notice. Newsreels and newspapers that had for years focused on Europe or the Pacific Islands began to tell the incredible story of the road that had been carved through the jungle. They called it the Ledo Road, a simple, geographical name for one of the greatest engineering feats of the modern age. But in China, for the man who had benefited most from its creation, that name was not enough. In a moment of historic magnanimity, Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, the Chinese leader who had so often clashed with the acerbic American general, proposed that the road be given a new name. From that day forward, it would be officially known as the Stilwell Road. It was the ultimate vindication for a man who wasn't there to receive it. In one of the great ironies of the war, General Joseph Stilwell had been recalled from his command in October 1944, just 3 months before the road was completed. His relentless advocacy for reform in the Chinese army and his brutally honest, undiplomatic style had finally exhausted the patience of both Chiang Kai-shek and President Roosevelt. Vinegar Joe was sent home, relieved of his command, just as the victory he had obsessed over for 3 years was finally within reach. He never saw the first convoy depart. He never drove on the finished road that would carry his name into history. He learned of its opening from thousands of miles away, a sideline general whose personal war had been won in his absence. The naming of the road was therefore more than an honor, it was a final verdict on his controversial legacy. His critics, and there were many, had called him impossibly stubborn, insubordinate, and blind to political realities. They were not wrong, but the road itself was the undeniable counterargument. It was a monument to the very qualities that made him so difficult. A more diplomatic, cautious man would have accepted the British assessment that the project was impossible. A more politically savvy commander would have given up in the face of the immense logistical and environmental challenges. But Stilwell's single-minded, furious determination was the human engine that drove the entire project forward. He bullied, cajoled, and threatened his way through every obstacle, be it a skeptical ally, a reluctant subordinate, or a mountain of mud. It was a victory of pure, unadulterated will. And now, his road was a living, breathing entity. The single first convoy was quickly replaced by an endless 24-hour stream of traffic. Convoys of 60 trucks would depart Ledo every 2 hours. Military police stations were set up at intervals to manage the flow, and repair depots worked around the clock to fix breakdowns. The pipeline running alongside it was pumping thousands of barrels of fuel a day, feeding the thirsty engines of the Chinese Army and the American Air Forces now based in China. The Stilwell Road was no longer a construction project. It was a weapon, a massive logistical superweapon that was now pouring the industrial might of America directly into the heart of the Asian continent, aimed squarely at an enemy who was about to feel its full, crushing weight. The Stilwell Road was more than just a symbol. It was a weaponized artery that began pumping the full, unrestrained power of American industry directly into the heart of a long-starved war. The trickle of supplies that had bravely flown over the hump was now a torrent roaring down the road. For the first time in 8 years of brutal warfare, the Chinese armies could face their Japanese adversaries on something approaching equal terms, and soon on terms of overwhelming superiority. The dragon, cornered and bleeding for so long, had been resupplied, and it was now ready to unleash its fury. The spring and summer of 1945 saw a transformation on the battlefields of southern China. Entire Chinese divisions, retrained by the Americans in India and now fully equipped with weapons and munitions that had rolled down the new road, went on the offensive. The Japanese soldiers, who for years had been the masters of the field, suddenly found themselves on the receiving end of concentrated, accurate artillery barrages. They watched in disbelief as Chinese infantry, who had once been forced to rely on sheer numbers and courage, now advanced behind tanks and were supplied by fleets of American trucks. The hunter had become the hunted. The logistical tables had been completely, decisively turned. For the Japanese armies in both China and Burma, the situation rapidly became untenable. Their own supply lines were stretched to the breaking point, while the enemy was now better fed, better armed, and possessed seemingly infinite reserves of ammunition. The same Japanese divisions that had once seemed invincible were now starving, isolated, and being systematically ground down. Their retreat turned into a rout. In Burma, the British 14th Army, pushing up from the south, finally cleared the last remnants of Japanese resistance. Their task made immeasurably easier by the collapse of the enemy's logistical and command structure, a collapse accelerated by the pressure from the north. The great convoys continued to roll east, carrying the material for what was intended to be the final phase of the war, a massive Allied offensive across China to establish air bases for the ultimate invasion of Japan. The Stilwell Road was meant to be the logistical backbone of this final push. But history had one last ironic twist. Before that grand offensive could be fully realized, atomic flashes lit up the skies over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the Second World War came to a sudden, stunning end. The road did not get to fulfill its final intended purpose, yet its contribution was already cemented. For 3 years, the campaign to reopen it had tied down hundreds of thousands of elite Japanese troops. It had saved a nation of 400 million people from collapse. And in the final analysis, the story of the Burma campaign was a testament to the idea that the most decisive battles are not always the largest or most famous, but are often the ones fought by forgotten armies in forgotten places against impossible odds for a cause that simply cannot be abandoned.